Good afternoon, everyone. This is Steve Bailey from NMA headquarters, and I want to welcome you to Decision Making in the Art of Negotiation. This is the second time two of our key NMA volunteer leaders have led this webinar today, and I want to thank them for their time. First of all, Bob Noel from our Pacific South area. He's from Boeing in Huntington Beach, California. And we have Kathy Spatz from the Columbus Public Service Chapter in Columbus, Ohio. Kathy is also our 2015 NMA National Secretary. So when we were sitting around as a board and staff and looking at webinar titles for 2015, Decision Making in the Art of Negotiation was one of the first ones that came up. And almost as quickly as it came up, Kathy and Bob volunteered to do a seminar on it. And that was September. Now here we are, January, and it's time. So I know from this morning they have a great seminar, and all of you logged on to listen to them, not to me. So I'm going to sign off and ask Bob and Kathy to take over. So ladies and gentlemen, Bob Noel and Kathy Spatz.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. Kathy, are you on the line this afternoon?
I am.
Perfect. That's great. Why don't we go to slide 2? And this just has a little bit more of the review. All of you can look at this later when you look at the package, I guess. One thing Steve said about Kathy and I volunteering, it sounds very great, but the honest truth is that Kathy and I are probably out of the room. So anyway, we're very happy to present this material. We think it's really important stuff. Making decisions is a key part of your day-to-day life and business success and the success of organizations like NMA and all of our chapters. So, important thing to present. This morning I asked people at this juncture to go ahead and think of an important decision you may have made last year and think a little bit about how you decided that. We ran a little bit late this morning, so I'm going to skip that, but I do want to emphasize that later it's a good idea to think through that and maybe think about the techniques and the discussion we have today and think about that decision and whether that you might have changed something a little bit. Okay, so why don't we go ahead to the next slide, that's slide 3. Here's the agenda today. We're going to talk about decision making, what influences decisions, considerations about long-term, and one of my favorite topics, the cost of indecision. A simple method for making decisions, introductions for negotiation, how they tie together, some considerations, and how to get what you really want in a negotiation, and then a summary. So let's go ahead to the next one. Okay, so decision making. I think most of you probably would concur with the top line here that it's critical. And when you think about what you do every day, whether it's your personal life, whether it's part of your chapter operations, things you do at work, decision-making really influences everything about your life. I have a friend who runs a short session on being a victim and how you really shouldn't be. And he talks about the fact that people like to say, well, this happened to me, I was unlucky, I'm lucky, maybe also is part of the victim mindset, that really things are out of your control. But if you really carefully look at it and look at a lot of the articles associated with the decision making, things really are not out of your control. A lot of the things that happen to you are based on decisions you made. Even if, say, you won the lottery, you did make the decision to buy a ticket. You put yourself in a position to be successful or lucky. So things like that really do come down to decision making. So some are minor, some are not minor. You can probably think of a number of things that are not minor decisions, like to accept a job offer, who you marry, perhaps buying a car, that's a pretty big investment, buying a house. Then the minor ones, it's amazing, but sometimes we stress out over the minor ones, like which candy bar to buy or what to have for lunch. But You know, the whole problem is that a lot of times we take too long to make decisions and then we make the wrong ones. So some things to consider. A lot of our decisions, we don't really consider all the real data. And by data, I mean the properties that are important for the decision, the real weighting of different properties, what's the critical things, what are all the consequences, perhaps what are all the options. So if we can avoid leaving out factors like that, bad decisions are avoidable, as the tagline says. All right, let's go ahead. So now we're on slide number 5. So here's some things that you probably, all of you probably thought of already in terms of what influences decisions. Certainly the cost of something. You know, if you're buying a new car, if you're authorizing a contract for a supplier, how much are they charging? That's definitely an impact to almost all of us. There are a few of us that can say cost is unimportant completely. And I'd like to be one of those people, by the way. So if you want to send contributions, my email address, I'll give that at the end. Anyway, availability is another factor. You might not think of that normally in your day-to-day life, but I have a great example. I have a friend that last year really wanted a great television, a nice big flat screen TV to watch the Super Bowl. And he went out and ordered it. And as it turned out, one thing he didn't take into account was the delivery time. Well, the TV was delivered the week after Super Bowl. So, you know, those things happen, but he made the wrong decision. He could have got a similar model, which was available right away, and that would have been a better decision. Weight. Weight is a very common thing, especially here in my neck of the woods in aerospace. It's very important for rocket launches, for satellites, for aircraft. How much things weigh is very impactful. But even if you're deciding on other things, just carrying something yourself, like a new suitcase. A lot of people pick a suitcase based on how much it weighs. They like to get the lightweight ones. And with the new TSA rules, where you have to have a 50-pound or lighter suitcase to avoid a $100 fee or something from the airlines, some of those things become pretty important. And there's many, many other known factors, things that all of us could probably immediately say. But part of the reason we're having this discussion is to talk about the unknown things, things that you really don't maybe even know you're doing, like appeal. One of the famous stories, and I quoted it this morning from the New York Times a while back, was about how the Boeing F-35 entrant, which is the Joint Strike Fighter, how it didn't really appeal to the pilots that were on the acquisition control board. And while that wasn't necessarily a stated requirement, or at least not very clearly, it obviously is very important. So all of us, when we go to make a decision on something, whatever it is, there's sort of that how does it feel kind of thing that doesn't really necessarily have a quantifiable and obvious way of stating it, but it's an important thing to realize. Personal bias is another one. I don't like white cars, especially large white cars, because to me they look like rolling refrigerators. But would I ever put that down as a criteria? Probably I'd forget about it, but I just know something in the back of my mind bothers me about the choice. So these are things that you really ought to try and understand about yourself maybe, and understand before you make a decision. Unstated factors, some more things like that. I won't go into too much more on that, but these are things that, as they say in the military, there's things we know that we don't know, and there's things we don't know that we don't know. And maybe some of that falls into this category. Okay, let's go to slide 6. You probably have seen this kind of concept before. I find it to be particularly strong in America, but as I travel around the world, it seems like we make a lot of decisions based on short-term thinking. And a lot of it is understandable. We have people that will ask, what have you done for me lately? What's the budget today? How are we doing? And you make decisions based on trying to improve your short-term position. Unfortunately, many of the decisions we make, we have to live with long-term. For example, think about the decision on whether to accept a marriage proposal. It used to be only women had to worry about that. These days, it might be everybody, but the person you marry, the automobile you purchase, things like that, they have to be considered long-term because they're things you're going to have to deal with. So as much as you can, you ought to consider some of those things, like how will you use this part or this system, or how will you relate to this person years from now? Do you have the same goals, long-term goals? I know a friend that married a lady that they never even talked about whether they wanted to have kids, and they find out after they got married that she didn't want kids. He wanted 7. How do you resolve things like that? You know, they should have considered that more. I'm not saying that, you know, they shouldn't have got married, but it is certainly something to discuss. They had a lot of fights about that. They resolved it, and it just turned out they didn't have any kids. But anyway, it's certainly something to consider. In a business sense, what parts will be available? Obsolescence is a major concern when you're building a long-term system. I know it for some of our systems. Look at the B-52 bomber. That's been around 50 plus years. It's hard necessarily to find things that interface with the original bomber. There's a lot that has to be done, and sometimes even if you can find that stuff, it ends up being very expensive because the supplier knows that you really kind of need them, and justifiably they put a lot of effort into creating the parts so they can charge for it. But this also applies for you know, personal decisions like automobiles. Are you buying from a dealer that, you know, maybe on shaky ground, may even go out of business? You can imagine if there's no right or wrong, perhaps, but you can imagine if car dealers were allowed to go under and maybe disband a couple of years ago, that all the owners of Chevrolets and GMs may not have been able to find parts. You know, it might have been a problem. Who knows, but it could be. And then one major thing that a lot of people overlook is the cost of operation. So you might think, well, I bought this vehicle or system or whatever it is, and I got a good deal on it. Okay, but now let's talk about how much it's going to cost you to keep that going. So a luxury car, for example, you know, it's a great thing, but you've got to buy the more expensive gas. You might have to have more frequent service. Sometimes parts are far more expensive than they would be for a standard automobile. So all of these things can be part of a long-term way of thinking and important things to think about. Go ahead to slide number 7. Okay, going to a little bit of psychology, there's an assessment out there called the Myers-Briggs Personality Assessment. If you're not familiar with it, there is one aptitude test at the, it's the last letter actually, it's a 4-letter aptitude test, but the last one is called judging or perceiving. And that one is particularly important for this chart because judgers, people that are called judgers, it sounds like a bad thing, but what they have a very strong preference for is they like to make decisions and get things done, take action. Even if it's the wrong action, it feels better to them than not making a decision. On the opposite end of that scale is a group called perceivers. Perceivers would rather consider carefully all the options, even if it means delaying a decision. Well, there's good and bad things to both, of course. The judgers sometimes will overlook important criteria that should have influenced their decision, while the perceivers sometimes will extend the decision period so long that they miss some opportunities. So you can see what happens when we wait. Opportunities slip by. As an example, if you take too long to determine, you know, an automobile you might want or a restaurant you might want to go to, it's quite possible restaurants will close. Automobiles may go out of production. On a business end, if we can't decide what to bid for a proposal our customer wants us to bid on, we may miss the window and not be able to bid, and therefore not be able to do that work. So those are important things to bear in mind, that you may totally miss out on something that would be beneficial and would be even better. It'd be better if you made the right decision, did everything right, but even if you don't quite get it all correct, it would be better to have that opportunity and have a chance to make it right. People change their mind as well. You know, that's something where people will offer you an opportunity, such as a job offer, and you take too long to consider whether or not you want to take it, well, they may rescind the job offer. And that was obviously a major impact to your life, potentially. Budgets will shift. Money for different projects and money may be reallocated outside your influence, and you may in fact have to use the money for something else. So that could be a positive too. And by the way, if people change their minds, sometimes that's a positive too, where, you know, if it's something you want to work with other people on, and if those people do another analysis and decide that maybe this really wasn't going to be the right thing, maybe it's better to nip it in the bud, as they say, and find that out early, but still, it's something to work on rather than just wait on. So a better approach that's recommended here is to make a plan. Look at all the alternatives. Get smart people, maybe even other people like me in the room, and do some brainstorming. Think of all the possibilities. Lay them all out on the table. Then slowly eliminate them until you have a plan. Make a decision, but always have a way to fall back. You know, make the plan, carry it through, execute it as best you can. But if something isn't working, you should always have a way out. Now, that's easier in some decisions than others, such as in the LA area, when we drive around from one place to another, fortunately, we have a plethora of freeways to choose from, because frequently one freeway is worse than another. So if we have Google Maps or something like that available to us, and by the way, I'm not suggesting looking at that while you're driving, it's a good idea potentially to choose a different route and have that plan. On the other hand, like marriage, it's not such an easy thing to have a fallback plan. So you've got to consider that a little bit more carefully. Okay, why don't we go to the next one? So here's slide 8, and what I want to introduce is a simple method for making decisions. And so some of you that come from aerospace or engineering may recognize this, but two gentlemen, Kepner and Trigo, came up with this very simple technique. It's their comparison technique. And what they suggest is that you choose the properties of a decision or a solution that are important. So for example, if you're choosing a television, maybe the size of the television, maybe the fact that it's LED or plasma, maybe the cost of it, the delivery time. My friend would have thought that was important now. Things, the weight of the television perhaps, all of those things could come into play as critical properties. But it's important to come out with a very complete list of those properties and then pare it down if you can, but not, as you see in the very bottom tagline, take the time to do it right. So come out with all the properties up front and ask other people what they think. Look at Consumer Reports if that makes sense. You know, if it's a team decision, make sure everybody has a chance to input to each of these, but especially the properties part of this. Then once you narrow that down to the key properties you really want to consider, weight them. In other words, assign a relative value. And I'll show you a little bit numerically how that works in the upcoming slides. But it's something really important to ensure that you've considered things in the proper relevance to your own decision. Then some mechanics come after that. Select a way to score it numerically. Select some alternatives, and note that the alternatives are finally down here after all the other things about the decision have been decided. It's the Ford F10 or whatever pickup, you know, those are things you can decide, but you don't want the possible alternatives, and remember those unstated factors, you don't want those things influencing which properties. So for example, if you wanted to select between a job in Alaska, a job in Northern California, and a job in Kuwait, and you've always loved foreign travel, you may end up, after determining those are the alternatives, just have the one property foreign location to be a heavily weighted thing, and it really didn't make sense. And then you get there and you're miserable. So that's something important to keep in mind. And then you'll score each one of these and select the alternative. Those two are usually not too bad. So it's important to keep this order and take the time to do it right. Let's go on to slide 9. This is a potential decision someone might make. It's an important decision. Cars go anywhere from $15,000 to, I don't know how much, maybe 140, given some of the real sporty cars, maybe more. But here's some properties you might consider on buying a new car. I just listed 3, and I know gas prices are down, but mileage might still be an important one. How many miles per gallon you're going to get out of this car. Loading capacity, if you're the kind of person that buys a lot of hardware or goes to the nursery a lot, maybe that's an important thing for you. Safety, a lot of people consider that important. We're going to make the choice to weight these equally in the table on the next page. You'll see that. And then I just randomly picked a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, 10 or best. And then some alternatives that unfortunately I happen to know prices and gas mileage and things for these guys. The Toyota Prius, the Tesla Model S, Ford F-10 pickup, and the Chevy Suburban. So this doesn't necessarily have to be a complete list, but notice the properties came first, the decision on weighting was next, a scale was after that, and then the alternatives, not the other way around. Okay. So here's a table, and if I had been able to log into Zoom properly and modify this on the fly, what my plan was to enter the data real time. But I'll show you an example that is filled out on the next page. But on this, on this page, so slide 10, just to talk through it a little bit, if you consider mileage, for example, as a key property, the Toyota Prius gets somewhere around 38 to 40 miles per gallon highway, I believe. And so on a scale of 1 to 10, that'd probably be somewhere around a 7, right? Something like that. The Tesla Model S, it doesn't use gas, but it has an effective mileage per gallon of about 62 miles per gallon based on the amount of electricity you have to use and how much that costs. The Ford F-10 pickup doesn't do anywhere near as well. It's generally around 16 to 18 miles per gallon, and the Suburban's probably the worst, so it's a low score. It would probably get maybe a 1 for its 11 miles per gallon. On the other hand, if you look at capacity, the Toyota Prius is probably one of the worst. It's got a very small vehicle size. Of course, that's what helps it get the mileage it gets, but it would probably score a very low number on that one, maybe a 3. The Tesla Model S is bigger, and in the front of the vehicle is a pretty good sized trunk, and it has a back seat, so maybe it would get maybe a 5, something like that. Pickup has an extended cab, would really help, but it would probably get a 6 or 7. And the Suburban is the king of capacity. It would probably get 9 or 10. It's got lots of space to put all your gear, your kids, all their soccer equipment, whatever it is, plenty of room. So when you fill out the table under each automobile model, the left column would be where you would put these numbers I'm taking and throwing out there for you. The right column would be the multiplication of that number times the weight. Now all of these have a weight of 0.25, and I've left out one of the properties. But you can see where you would be able to get some kind of product for each number times the 0.25, and then add them up and see who's the winner. Now, I left out one property, and I'm wondering if you have some idea on what would make a good 4th property when you're making this decision on buying a car. Anybody have any ideas?
Color.
We had one in the room that says color.
Cost.
Acquisition cost came up. Anything else?
How about size?
Size, capacity, size, pretty close. Cost. Okay, this morning somebody brought up reliability, which would be an excellent choice, right? You know, and operating costs, the cost of gas and maintenance and all that kind of thing. You know, that would be an important thing. For the Tesla Model S, I don't know this, but, you know, it may be at some point you've got to replace that electrical engine. That might be a cost coming down the road you've got to factor in. But the bottom line here is that all of those things are good, but you can see that this analysis or this matrix really didn't take into account all that stuff. So if you were doing it on your own, you probably want to consider all of that stuff. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, slide 11. So here's one we do in one of our classes at Boeing, just as sort of a joke and sort of a way to introduce the idea. And this one's all filled out for you. This is a decision about what snack to eat. I know it says when to eat a snack, but it's what snack to eat. And so first we selected the criteria. So our panel came out with how much is the snack cost, how good does it taste, and how healthy is it. And then they made the fateful decision to assign the weighting that you see there. 0.2 went to the cost. 0.3 went to the taste, and a full 0.5 went to how healthy the snack is. And those all add up to 1. That's not important, but, you know, it's one way you can do it. And then we selected the various, we selected a scale, 1, 3, 9. That kind of forces some disparity and forces one to be a winner. And then we selected the options, a Snickers bar, a little bit of Ben & Jerry's ice cream, which was my favorite by far, and then the piece of broccoli. And because of the weighting of the healthfulness, you can see the piece of broccoli being the winner. It got a 9 for healthfulness. That got it 4.5 full points. It's going to be hard to beat that. And so we always joke about in the classes that in the afternoon we're going to bring in some broccoli for people. Of course, we don't bring in anything because we don't have any budget, but the funny part about it is that people now regret the decision, regret things. One thing I would say is that if you really did take the time and determine those were the right criteria, that was the right weighting, the right scale up front, and you did it right, you really shouldn't second guess the decision. A lot of times you'll see people make a decision using a method like this and go, but that can't be right. And they go back and change numbers and change criteria so that the one they really wanted is the one chosen. That's a big mistake because what that really is doing is reducing your decision down to what do I want, not what do I need or what's the best decision for the future. Very, very short term. All of us can probably relate to a time when we weren't able to get that great treat we really wanted, like the Ben & Jerry's or the donut or whatever, and we ate something more healthy. Well, frankly, the next day, did it really matter? In fact, don't you feel better? You know, so long term, it's probably the right choice to pick out the broccoli. And now I'll let your mother carry on from there. So, so let's go to the next slide. Another possible technique is called the pairwise comparison. And so this is a very useful technique if you have lots and lots of alternatives. And so what you do is list out the alternatives and take pairs of them and compare them against each other. It's a little time consuming, but it can be useful, especially for decisions that aren't super critical. And I've applied it, and we will see in the next page in a second, to the best flavor of ice cream. Those of you that follow March Madness and know the NCAA basketball tournament, you can relate this to bracketology. So why don't you go ahead to the next slide, slide 13. This shows my ice cream bracket. And so apologies right away to the NCAA, as you can see. And I've only filled out one side, but this is how you could do it. You could start, you go to Baskin Robbins or your favorite ice cream place and write down all the different flavors and pair them up. So you can see chocolate and black walnut paired up. And because this isn't a really important decision, and it's not going to change the path of your life very much. This works pretty well. You can immediately, if you're like me, say, are you kidding? Chocolate is the winner. Okay, so I move on, put chocolate in the next row. And then peach and cookies and cream, well, for me it'd be cookies and cream. And so on, and keep comparing them little by little until you find a winner at the end. And then just order that and don't second guess it, because you did a pretty organized way of making your decision.
Good.
Yeah. So anyway, the ice cream bracket. So that's another possible technique. All right, let's go to slide 14. So decisions, you know, we all have to make them. I think we talked about that. It's what really guides our lives. It is the key thing that we do that changes the path of our lives and the path of our businesses and our chapters. It helps to decide them objectively, you know, because it takes out the factors, the unstated factors that maybe you're making a short-term decision or a decision based on incomplete data. And using these tools helps you do that, so it's indicated by that arrow. Indecision is sometimes worse than a bad decision, and frankly, a lot of times indecision is a decision. It's a decision not to act. Leaders don't usually make that decision, right? So that's not something most chapter leaders would want to do, or leaders of your company. You wouldn't necessarily want to do that. And it's good to have a backup plan. But the bottom line there is, once you make a decision, is it completely up to you to do something with it? What do you do with them? So let's talk about negotiation. Go ahead to the next slide. That's 15. It's what you have to do to get what you need. Unless, you know, if you've seen the movie Castaway, where he's on the island. Is that Tom Hanks, I think? Yeah, Tom Hanks ends up on an island, and he's pretty much in charge. You know, there's not too many people saying, you know, what he can do. But in real life, that isn't the way it works. People have influence over each other. I can make all the decisions I want as long as my wife says it's okay, right? I mean, it's not the case where you just can rule the roost and you're in charge of everything and nobody can say anything to you. You know, even decisions at work, decisions in your chapters for sure. Your leadership teams in your chapters should be working together to make decisions. So you have to negotiate, and a big part of negotiation is making sure you understand what's important to you and what's important to the other people as they represent your chapter, your work, and their own interests. So you have to work with other people. So we want, it's kind of a joke there, it helps with the repeat business. We want repeat business. We want people to think we're ethical, honorable, that we will work to their interests and our own, to be fair. Sometimes you hear about used car salesmen. They don't necessarily look at it that way. I think I've talked to a few of them that say, well, I'll sell you a car today, and I'll probably never see you again, so why do I care if it's, you know, that was pretty straightforward information from a guy, I guess I shouldn't mention the dealership, but it's here in Southern California, and he just walked away. So anyway, it happens. Go ahead to the next slide. This is slide 16. So I wanted to bring this up and if you're on, Sue, if you're on slideshow mode, you have to click a few times, remember. This is a standard model for conflict. And as with most social science kind of concepts, it is shown as an XY graph. So value of winning, value of getting your way basically on the y-axis, and value of the relationship on the x-axis. And really what conflict is about negotiation and how much of it you use. So let's start in the upper left, the commando. The commando is the person that comes in, they know what they want, and the heck with everybody else, right? And they're going to get what they came for. Now, sometimes you have to do that. When the fireman runs in the building and says, everybody evacuate, it's not time to negotiate. It's time to get out of the building. And you have to just do what he says, right? It's the right way to do it. So the commando, being the fireman, is not going to brook discussion. So that's okay. The cutter down there on the bottom left is the case where you've got a situation where, again, you're not going to win, and you really don't care about the situation. There isn't a lot of these, but an example of this is when somebody comes up to you and wants you to do something, and you just don't have the time to do it, and you say, you know, I can't do it, and they still want you to do it, and you say, I'm sorry, and you walk away. And so once in a while that happens. The collapser, that's kind of a negative term perhaps, but what that really means is that you value this relationship, that you're willing to make your interests subservient to the relationship. So an example I used this morning, so you're talking to your boss, and your boss says, I can't give you a raise this year. But if you work really hard, I should be able to make a really good case for you next year. So to the extent that you trust your boss and you have a good relationship, you may decide to defer what you want and to go ahead with his or her advice on working toward the following year. The compromiser, we've all made compromises in life. You know, that's something where I'm willing to give up something to preserve our relationship. I don't get everything I want. Frankly, the other party probably doesn't either, but we both agree that that's just something, and usually that can be done very quickly where we look at something. But the best state of them all is the collaborator, and that's up in the upper right. How can we both get what we want? And what this comes down to is really understanding what the other person needs. But also being fair and saying, I know what I need. So decisions come into play here where I have to decide what it is I need. So you can imagine if you went to a car dealer and they're getting something out of it, of course, they're getting the money for the car, but they want to really make sure you're getting the car you really want and need. And they're helping you understand all the critical parts of that decision. Wouldn't you feel inclined to want to go back to them? So a dealer like that is willing to help you get everything you really need, they look at future business as perhaps an important case. And so that's an example of that kind of thing. So that's where negotiation is the strongest in this model. There's very little in the cutter and only a little in the other ones. So go ahead to the next slide, that's 17. So when you collaborate, I think I already stated, you need to really understand what other people need. So the way to find out is ask. Sometimes people don't know what they need. And so if you have a background in the particular subject area, it's up to you now to say, well, have you considered this? How about that? You know, and ask questions. Find out, make them think about what they need, help them decide using some of the techniques we've talked about today. Be curious. Really try and grasp it. Because at the end of the day, it will help you collaborate with them to understand what their needs are. The next bullet talks about knowing what you want. You have to be able to tell them what you want, and you have to be able to tell them in a way they understand. So we had a speaker here at BLASC named Craig Weber, which talked about, Craig talked about the concepts of curiosity and candor and really trying to get those concepts out there and make people understand there's good ways to ask questions and bad ways. So you can imagine a boss coming into a meeting saying to people, does everybody agree with me? Well, a lot of people are going to say, oh yes, boss, even if they don't. So that boss isn't all that curious. That boss is really more about just getting validation. If you want to do it right, what you ought to do, and you can do this in your meetings as well, in your chapter meetings, is say, those of you that already agree with me, that's great, thank you. But I really need to hear from those that disagree, because those people are the ones that are going to tell me potentially things I'm missing. Now, if someone disagrees with you, that doesn't make them right, but at least forces you to take a different point of view. And that different point of view can lead to better decisions and certainly more successful negotiations. So if both sides really want to make it work, it can work. And it comes down to being a good conversationalist, conversational skills. And I can give anybody that's interested, by the way, if you want more information about Craig Weber, I'm happy to provide that. Just send me an email. And I'll also send some information to Sue about that, so you can go through anime too. Okay, let's go to 18. So a little bit about brainstorming, exploring alternatives. You know, important decisions, you really shouldn't rush them. You really shouldn't rush negotiations either. And so it might take you a while to get the right answer. Get the other side involved in the decision. Involve them, make them part of it. Ask for what's important to them. If you're making a decision along with them, ask them how much to weight it. Have them become a part owner. They'll have more pride in the right work getting done, and you'll probably have better results. Brainstorming is a critical area that we sometimes kind of laugh at in our work and in our chapters, but listen to those crazy people. Those crazy people, sometimes it sounds silly what they're saying, but there's been a number of notable inventions throughout world history that started off as something that people thought were crazy. You know, one of my favorite examples of this, anybody a Back to the Future movie fan, in one of the Back to the Future movies, I think it was the first part where Marty goes back in time and talks to people about how people buy bottled water. And everybody starts laughing. They can't believe it. But if you look at it today, it's certainly part of our culture, right? That's something we do a lot of. And it's convenient, although maybe it's not great for the environment. But anyway, it's something that, you know, sounded ridiculous, but yet here we are doing it. So it is something to get those out on the table, and don't restrict the conversation. Listen to everybody's ideas, make people all part of it. And if someone's quiet, you know, say, hey, I'm going to call on you in a minute, so think of something, you know, maybe. Maybe they'll walk out of the meeting. I don't know. But critical thing is to really try and get everybody's involvement, because it's amazing how you get better decisions, better negotiation from more involvement. So ownership's a good thing. Okay, so that's what I had to present today. I'm finishing fairly on time. I wanted to finish at 12:45 Pacific or 3:45 Eastern to give people a chance to ask questions perhaps. But in summary, we got to make decisions. It's part of life. It's part of being part of a group, part of a business, part of a chapter, just in our daily lives. Good decisions are okay. Bad decisions are okay too, because we can learn something from bad decisions. But the best decisions are usually the objective ones, where we've really considered everything. Even though it doesn't seem like the best decision at first, it usually ends up being the best decision. Doing nothing, that's a decision, but it's not really a very good one, and you don't learn very much from inaction. So that can be a problem. Negotiation, it's a skill. It's something you really have to think about, and it's hard to catch yourself and to ask probing questions and to really be honestly curious about the other people's or the other party's point of view. Skilled sales staff, they get this. I had a friend that was a salesman in the Portland, Oregon area. He's still a salesman, and he gets paid something like $350,000 a year. And I just said, come on, why are they paying you that? And he said, you don't understand, it's really a skill. And he makes a lot of money for his company. He's worth it. So it really is a skill that can be developed. But anybody can do it with practice, with some of the ideas here. And of course, there's much more on the internet. We have some links we can send out as well to various topics on decision-making and negotiation. But they are linked processes, and they really are critical to what we do as chapter leaders, as people, and as people that work for companies and governments. So with that, let me open the phone line, or actually Sue, open the phone line up and see if we have any questions. That's done. Sue, are you still there? Anybody still out there?
We're here. Roger's here.
Hi, Jack. This is Steve Bailey, or Jack. Hi, Bob. This is Steve Bailey. Yes, I can tell everyone's still there.
Okay. So any questions?
Well, Bob, when we were making a decision and we were weighting it, were we weighting it for good factors or bad factors or both?
Okay, so when you're, that's Steve Stakely here in the room in Huntington Beach, and the question is, when we're weighting something, are we weighting it for good factors or bad factors? Well, the first thing I want you to do is determine the factors and narrow them down to a group of good key factors you want to make the decision about, and then weight those. So it's the good factors. Kathy, do you have any examples you want to bring up of decisions you've made one way or the other?
Well, one of the key things that we need to evaluate daily is how much is a project going to cost, how much communication can you share with the public, and how much time is it going to take to do it. All of them being weighted differently and all of them having different parameters.
Yeah, good point. I think sometimes things that are easy to measure, like how much things cost, you have to be careful that you don't overwhelm things like how important or how good is this project. How valuable is it technically or something like that. That's a harder thing to measure, but you have to strive to measure them all equally. Any other questions?
Well, Bob, this is Steve. This isn't exactly a question, but you touched on something today that I think is really important when it comes to decision making, and that is the idea that data can be king, but data is not omnipotent. Actually, that sounded pretty good. I just made that up.
Wow.
What I mean by that is so many of our decisions are data-driven everywhere, whether it's NMA or certainly out in your business and industry. Yet there's usually context to data. And I think if you're a really good decision maker, and if you are determined to make the very best decisions you can, you stop when you look at data and go, why? Or as my mother used to say, I said when I was little, how's come? Because numbers themselves don't always tell the whole story. So decision making, I believe, requires that you always have, and maybe it's the history major in me, you always have the background, and that you always know what these numbers mean in places other than on the page that you're looking at.
Yeah, that's a good point. And for those of you that like to make what we call gut decisions, what we're really talking about here is adding some rigor, adding some background to that decision. But, you know, if you're the other side and you're very data-driven, as Steve says, then maybe a little bit of the gut decision mentality should be applied as well, as a check perhaps on, you know, the reality of whether you're doing things correctly.
One of the things you can also consider while looking at that data is determine whether it's a real or a phantom adversary or a real or phantom data, because sometimes it's truly perception and the reality can flush some different situations that appear clear to begin with, but you still have to do a little more research to find the true answers that you need.
Right, and so an example of that too is that in those tables, if you weight one of the properties very strongly, a small difference in your perception of its value could swing the decision one way or the other. So you have to look at that, make sure that you're not just throwing numbers that don't mean anything into the table. Thanks, Kathy. Anything else?
Bob, this is Steve Bailey again. I do want to mention that this session today has been recorded. I didn't hear anyone say anything that they shouldn't have, but in transparency, and we're going to try and get better about this in the future on the front end and let people know that these are recorded. So if there are any hiccups or any issues with the fact that this session was recorded and you may or may not have said something and that bothers you, let us know and we'll take care of it. But otherwise, we do want to make these available throughout the year for people when they can't, for various reasons, log on and participate in webinars. We're going to try and make sure that we actually have a library of these recorded webinars. So on behalf of the NMA staff here in Dayton, all of whom have in one way or another been involved in this today, and for our membership and our board, I want to thank Bob and Kathy for doing this. And I want to thank all of you out there in NMA chapter land for logging on and participating. Let us know via phone calls and emails how these are going in your mind, what else you'd like to see, and what we can do to better serve you. So thanks a lot. A great way to kick off 2015. And since it's Thursday, have a good weekend, everyone.